Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So this video is going to be part of a technical series where I showcase on what kind of development work and technical work that we do in cybersecurity. And this video will be focusing on the coding side of things, so specifically on AWS Lambda functions. So before we get started, I just want to run down on what is a Lambda function. So in simple terms, a Lambda function is basically a service provided by AWS which allows you to run code without any server. So usually if you want to do automation with code on your computer, you would probably spin up a virtual machine like Windows and then put your code in that machine and then set up a schedule on Task Scheduler to run it. AWS allows you to do all that, but on the cloud. And this is really handy because it's literally zero downtime and it's relatively low cost solution. So now that we've talked about what is a Lambda function, let's talk about why we need Lambda functions specifically in cybersecurity. So from the perspective of SOC analyst, you're mostly dealing with a lot of alerts and incidents. And these alerts and incidents are generated through event logs on your SIEM platform. On a good day, an application has its own native Splunk app that allows you to seamlessly install on the platform and start ingesting the logs. But sometimes it's not that straightforward. Sometimes you need to pull logs directly from, let's say, an S3 bucket. So in this video, I'll run through with you guys on how to use a Lambda function and show you an example of how to read files from an S3 bucket. Alright, so once you've logged into the AWS portal, just search Lambda. And I'm going to create a new function. And AWS provides you different options for your Lambda function. So for example, you can author from scratch, or you can use a blueprint, which is pretty much like templates that AWS provides, or you can just use container image. What I'm going to do is author from scratch, and I'm going to name the function as my demo function. And we don't want to do Node.js because that's not my favorite. I prefer Python. And we're going to leave the architecture alone. There's nothing to change here. In the default execution role, I'm going to create a new role. So I'm going to leave it as this one here. And everything under additional configurations, let's just leave it as this. And just click create function. Alright, so now that the function has been created, let's go down to the bottom and we can see code. So this is where you would write your code and you can run and deploy and test different things here. So the first thing I always do is just delete this entire part and just type in print event. Now the reason why I did that is because I want to see every time what happens when my Lambda function gets triggered first. So essentially whatever comes through the Lambda function, we just want to see what the event is and see what we're dealing with. And the way we can test the Lambda function is by sending payloads in the form of JSON. So we can see down here that the template has defaulted to hello world, and this is the JSON payload, and we can just simply invoke. And here we can see it opens up a new tab under execution results, and this is the output of the function. And we can see this is the print that we did. Now usually when you're doing some code with Python, you would import multiple libraries. Like for example, if you want to import the pandas library, it will error out and say there's no module named pandas. Now this is because we haven't attached any libraries to the Lambda function. And the way we can do that is to go to the bottom and go under layers and add a layer. And we can choose the AWS layer, which is basically what AWS already have in their libraries. So we can just select this one here, which contains the pandas library. And let's select the latest version and click add. So now if we go test again, we don't have the error anymore. Now of course you can add your own custom libraries by going into the panel on the left here, going into layers, you can create a layer, and you can call it anything you want, and you can upload it as a zip file. Okay, so now that we've gone through the libraries, let's go through the configurations. And we can see there are a couple of things here. So under the general configuration, I always want to change the timeout to a bit longer because 3 seconds is a bit too quick. So I will go into edit, make it maybe 10 seconds, save that. And the next section is triggers. So in this trigger section, it basically allows you to set up anything to trigger your Lambda function. So for example, let's add a trigger for an S3 bucket. So for those who don't know, an S3 bucket is basically like an AWS version of a folder. So you can store different files and documents in that storage space. So let's select this one, my demo123, which is one I've created a while back. And we want to keep the event type as create event. So this is going to trigger an event for the Lambda function whenever we create a new file. And I'm going to click I acknowledge and then click add. Okay, so now that we've added the trigger, let's try and test it out. So what I'm going to do is search for S3. I'm going to go into the bucket, and this demo.txt is pretty much just a line of a payload in JSON format. So what I'm gonna do is just select that, go into actions and click copy. So what we're doing here is essentially just creating a new copy of the particular file which will trigger a create action. So what I'm going to do is select the destination bucket as the same S3 bucket, and I'm going to scroll all the way down and keep this part checked and then click copy. Okay, so that copy is done. Let's go back to the function. Now you might be thinking, how can we see the result of that trigger? We need to go into the monitor section and click on view CloudWatch logs. So CloudWatch logs is basically another AWS service that allows you to keep track of all the logs from your Lambda function. So down here we can see the log streams, and let's click on the latest event. And we can see this is the event that was generated from that copy action. And it's always going to be in JSON format. So what I usually like to do is to use this JSON payload as my test event so I can continuously build my Lambda function. So we can just copy this, go back to the function, go code, and we can click the drop down for the test, configure a test event, and we can just drop this here. And we can see there's something wrong with this particular line because it's in single quotes and not double quotes. So what I usually do is to use Notepad++ to replace the single quotes to double quotes. So let's drop that down here, and let's put a name to this test. Let's name it my test, save it, and let's click test. So here in the output, we can essentially see the same payload that we saw on CloudWatch logs. And what I usually like to do is to visualize the JSON payload. So I like using this JSON formatter website here, and I can just paste it in, and I can see on the right side here, everything is formatted in a nice, neat structure. And here I can see the first key is records, and it's a list that contains all the different payloads. And now you might be thinking, how can we read what's in the text file from this payload? The important things we need are the bucket name and the key here. So that means we need to go back to the function, and then let's try and extract the bucket name and the key out. And we need to import a library called Bodo3. And let's initialize it to a variable. And the next thing we need to do is extract the bucket name and key. So let's go bucket underscore name equals to event. And let's go back to the JSON format. And here we can see we need to go to records, and it's a list, so we gotta pick the first element. And this is under S3 bucket name. So event, records, the first element of the list, S3 bucket name. Let me copy this. And now we're doing it for the key. Same thing in records, first element of the list, and we're going down to S3 object key. So records, first element of the list, S3 object key. Now let's see if we've done it right. So what I'm going to do is print it out, bucket key format, put in the variables, let's save that, and let's click test. Alright, so here we can see the bucket name and the bucket key, which is exactly what we need. Now the next step is to use this library Bodo3 to get the object. So what we can do here is to create a variable, let's call it response s3.getObject. So getObject is a function of this Bodo3 library, and it takes in the bucket name and also the key. Now let's see what this response is. Okay, so now we're getting an error here, and it says access denied. So that means the function right now is unable to access the S3 bucket. So let's fix that up by going through configuration. We need to go into permissions, and we need to go into this row that we've created. So now let's scroll down to add permissions, attach policies. Let's type in S3, and I'm going to select full access. Usually from a security perspective, you wouldn't want to give full access to anything because that's just a vulnerability. But in this particular example, I'm just going to do it anyway because it's just demo. So for learning purpose, I would usually just add read-only access. Okay, so going back to the function, let's do the test again, see if we get the same error. Okay, now that the error has gone away, we have this particular response payload. And whenever the output is too long for this particular execution tab, you can always go back to the CloudWatch logs. So let's go back here, refresh, get the latest log stream, and we can see there's an encryption on the body. So what we need to do here is to decode this particular part of the body. So let's go back to the function, let's go response equals response, grab the body, and we want to read it, .decode in UTF-8. Now let's print the response again. Notice how I'm always printing between lines of code. This is kind of like a way to debug and make sure that you're coding in the right direction. So let's do a test. And here we can see this is exactly what we saw in the demo.txt file. Okay, so now whatever file lands in this S3 bucket will trigger this Lambda function here. Now we can take this one step further and send the response to Splunk. So for example, let's create a payload and let's put in the index as test index, and then the source type, let's do it as JSON, and for the event, let's put it as the response. So now this is the payload to send over to Splunk. We need to import the requests library. So let's type in requests, and the post REST API method takes in the URL as the first argument, the headers for the second one, and the data for the third one. So the first argument, which is the URL, has to be the Splunk host. So I'm going to put a random example here, but it needs to be your host name. And for headers, we need to put in the authorization, which is going to be the key for your Splunk event collector. So I'll put in Splunk token. So essentially, whatever the key is for your event collector, just replace it down here. So it could be something like this, just a random example. And for the data, we need to put in the JSON payload. So let's type in JSON DOMs payload. And that's pretty much it. So whenever a new file gets created on S3, it'll automatically trigger this Lambda function because we've already configured the trigger, and then it'll automatically send everything to Splunk. So that's just a quick and a somewhat beginner example of a Lambda function. Hope you guys enjoyed it and found it useful. And let me know in the comments if you guys want to see more of this type of technical videos. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.